Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Streaming Alchemy. I'm John Mahoney, and on today's show, we're going to take a look at how you can leverage dynamic variables inside of Vmix using scripting. So we think there's, some real interesting use cases in this beyond some of the obvious things it is used for, and we'll hopefully touch on something that will be useful to all of you. But before we get into that, I want to invite everybody, please, if you have any questions, any comments, just post them in the link below and, post them in the comments below, and we'll definitely try to get to everything you ask here on the show. Also, if you'd like to join us live on the show, please, we have a link in the show notes and here on the screen that will get you there. And if you want to join us, somebody from the studio will get you on air. All right, so I want to get started by showing you first what we're going to be implementing here using scripting and dynamic variables inside of Vmix. So what I wanted to set up was something that's more of a sports-based thing, but there's obviously multiple use cases here. And if you look at how I have this set up here, what I want to be able to do is say, I want to be able to add to a score or subtract from a score, if there was a mistake or something, for a team A and a team B. And we have different ways we're going to show doing this. That's why I have a couple of extra buttons here. And we have the ability to just reset the scores back to 0. So for instance, if I come up here and say team A scores a touchdown, I can just tack that, and it allows team A score. They scored the extra point. Team B scored a field goal. So we have this set up here as a simple way to just do score tracking, but it shows all of the things we want to demonstrate inside of the dynamic variables inside of Vmix. So before I get into the scripting piece, let me just jump over to sort of the Vmix screen and show you a bit about how this would actually work if we are just using standard, shortcuts and, the dynamic values as defined inside those shortcuts. So if I come in here and I have shortcuts set up, actually, before I get in here, let me just show you how this would look. So let me cancel out of here. And if I wanted to just have a single message I could put up. So I have a little message here that says touchdown. I can touch a button on the screen, on the Stream Deck, and push that message up. I can then touch another button and change that message. But what I'm doing is I'm using dynamic variables to do that. And then I can just have a blank message that I put and clear that. So let me show specifically how we ended up doing that inside the standard Vmix UI. So we set this up as shortcuts. So what I'm doing here, you can see these bottom 3 or bottom 4 are really setting up everything we need. So to work with dynamic values, the first thing you have to do is you have to set a value. So in this case, that's what we're using dynamic values. So if I wanted to set this to say touchdown, let me edit this. So what I have here is the ability to pick any one of up to 4 dynamic values. Everything dynamic values and dynamic inputs both have 4 of each. So you specify it as value 1, 2, 3, and 4. And when I select that, I then put the text that I want to store inside of that dynamic value. And so that's how we're doing this for all of the different dynamic values we have set up. So in this case, we have it for touchdown. We have it in this case for a punt. And the other case we have just has this set up as a blank. So we can clear it off the screen. And there's no value in there. So we basically clear it out. And the way we leverage this inside of a shortcut, in this case, since we're using a title, we'll do this with set text. What I actually do is say, I want you to set text, and you set everything up identically to the way you would do it before. But down here, where you'd actually normally put the text you want it to show, what you're telling it instead to use is take whatever value is in dynamic value 4 and leverage that as my text. So that's all you do with dynamic variables. So they can be very, very powerful. So there are dynamic values and dynamic inputs. Dynamic inputs would basically take place up here on the top. So if I were doing this at the scoreboard, if you look, I can say, instead of using a specific input that I set up, I can just go in and say, use one of the inputs that I set up here in my dynamics for, so it'd be dynamic input 1 to 4. So it's basically, you're either using it as a value or you're using it as an input. And those are the two ways that it's set up to work in sort of a very straightforward way inside the Vmix shortcuts. So what I really want to get into today, though, is how all of this would work if we were using scripting. But before we get into scripting, we have a few people who've signed in and to say hi. So we have Bill Ashton. Always great to have you, Bill. Thank you for joining us here. We have Dave Edwards. Dave, thank you for placing it on your calendar. Definitely great to have you here, Dave. And thank you for everything you do in the community as well. Definitely appreciate that. And we have Vangelis. So thank you, Vangelis. We, hopefully you'll find this useful on your end as well. So thank you. Okay, so let's get started looking at how we use dynamic values inside of a Vmix script. And so I have the first script over here, and this is basically the script that we use to change the score for Team A. So if we come down here, we're doing sort of the usual things. We're setting up our variables that will hold the score as a string, hold the score as an integer, and it has the score adjustment as a string and integer. Now, if you remember when I had the score adjustment on top, that was, is it add 1 point, add 2 points, 3 points, 6 points, or take that away, so it's sort of negatives. So that's what we're really handling in the score in the score adjustments here. So like we usually do, we start out by opening up the Vmix XML, because that's where all this data is being stored. And we take and load that in so we can start to leverage that. And the place we're going to first is to say, let's go in and we're going to read the dynamic value for dynamic value 1, because the way we have this set up is dynamic value 1 is score A, that's for Team A. Dynamic value 2 is the score for Team B, and dynamic value 3 is the adjustment that we're going to apply to that, how many points on or off for those scores. So that's how we have this set up. So we're reading, it's score for Team A, so we're reading dynamic value 1. And let me just see, I think I have this set up here. Okay, let me just go into local. I want to show you the, there we go. So here we go. This is the Vmix XML. And if you look down here on the bottom, there's a section in the XML called dynamic. And so the first 4 elements inside this XML tree is, XML node, is the 4 inputs. They're the input 1 to 4. So that's the part with dynamic inputs. And the second are dynamic values. So 7, 3, 3, and 4. So these are basically the scores, and our last adjustment was 4, 3. That's sort of how we have this set up. So you can see here exactly what we were doing with the XML. We're just reading it right out of here. So when we pull this in, we're pulling this 7 out through the script here, where we're saying Vmix dynamic value 1. And so that's exactly how we're working this to pull all this information out. Now, one of the things we're doing in this is, if this isn't set up already, if there was no value in there, nobody ever pressed, there's no score set up initially, what we're doing is we're saying, take and convert the score that's in there to an integer. And if it isn't a numeric value in there, this will fail. And that's what this try catch does. We've used this before, but to go over it. So if there is an illegal value, just a plain text string or nothing, what this will do is say, if this conversion fails, we're going to assume that we have to initialize it. And we do that in this area which says catch the exception. So there was a problem, so execute this code. And that's all we do. We come back here and say, set the value to 0, and then set the integer score to A, to 0 as well for team A. And that's the end of the try. So we're doing this just as a way to make sure if there's any error, we catch it and initialize it. The next thing we do is we basically do the identical thing except for the adjustment to the score. And so instead of value 1, which is team A, we're using value 3, which is the adjustment. And do the same logic here, try to convert it. If there's nothing there, we'll initialize it as well. So now what we're doing is we have an adjustment and we have a score. So we're taking the score that's in A for team A, and we're adding the adjustment to it and reassigning that back. So basically, this is something where, as opposed to setting the dynamic value through a shortcut, because we read this now, we can manipulate this value, increment it by the adjustment score, and then we can write it back. And in writing it back, we have to convert that I score A back to a string. Because all the values inside of these dynamic variables are just strings. So they're not special in nature. They're special in how they are leveraged inside the product, inside Vmix. So we do this conversion back to string, and we write it out. So this is the first thing that scripting lets you do. You can take a dynamic value, manipulate it somehow, and then write it back to update it. So that's, the first piece to this. And then all we're doing is we're updating that value on the scoreboard, and we then reset the dynamic value, the adjustment value, back to 0. So it sort of wipes it out and says, okay, you are back to, there's no update to the dynamic value now. So that means that if you like double pressed or something, you wouldn't accidentally increment twice. You just say like, nope, it just stays 0. So you have to select another adjustment before you add to or take away from a team score. So that is it. But the key piece here is that this is the first time, from a scripting point of view, that you can sort of look and say, now these are true variables. I can take and adjust them how I want. Why is this important? It's important because in scripting, natively, there's no way to just pass a variable. So if I start up another script or run this script again, there's no native way in the scripting itself that I can take and pass values between these different instances of scripting that I'm running. This is the first true mechanism to do that. People used to do it by doing things like putting a title up and changing values in titles and pulling those values out. So there was like convoluted ways to make it happen. But this is really now a truly well-integrated way inside of Vmix to pass values from one operational instance, be it a shortcut, be it a script, to another. And so that's the first thing. But as I mentioned, all of the elements here, all of the dynamic variables are just text. So there's even more we can do when we start to work with these variables in scripting. So let me just check in. We have a couple more comments here. No, let me see. So we have Bill Mew. Bill, thank you for joining us. Always great to have you coming in on the show. So appreciate you watching. Okay, so here's the next thing that I'd like to dive into. Let me go over here. As I mentioned, the dynamic variables are just text. So you can actually put anything that's textual in nature in it, including something like XML. So our goal now in this script is to say, if I didn't want to take up 3 dynamic value variables to do this, where I have, a team A, team B, and an adjustment, but I wanted to do that in fewer, I could conceivably put XML data into a dynamic variable and leverage that to manage the scores. So in this case, I just put the two scores in XML, but let's look at how we would do this as well. So in a very similar way, we have everything we set up for the scores for Team A, since this is an adjustment to Team A. We are also going to be reading the score for Team B. We're not going to adjust it in this script. We have a Team B script that will adjust it. So we don't need to convert it because we're not going to add or subtract from it, but we just need to have that because we have to save this back out again. So we have a place for the score for Team A, the score for Team B, and the adjustment that we want. And we also, since we're going to be manipulating XML, we want to set up a couple of XML strings that we can use as part of the process for tearing this XML out and getting the values out of it. So like we did previously, we load in the XML from Vmix. So this is where we read everything from. And now, as opposed to reading Team A as a score, so score A, what we're doing next is we're saying, let's actually take and read, in this case, we're storing it in dynamic value 4. That's our score that we're writing in there. And we're going to take and pull that into the XML scores. Now, the way this looks, it's pretty simple. We are, actually, let me jump in. I'm going to switch over to Vmix for a second. I can just show you where we set this up. So inside the shortcuts, I have something called reset here. And reset will launch a script. And that's reset script. If I show you it over here, it's basically setting up the initial values for the first 3 dynamic values we have set up. But in dynamic value 4, it's actually writing this block of XML here. So it's really simple. We are taking one sort of root node and then adding attributes to it with the team scores. So Team A equals 0 and Team B equals 0. So this is how we initialize it. But it is just a standard XML string that we have in there. So when we read this in and we initialize this, so we'll just push this out here. So let me go here and I will do the resets for the scores. So you can see we just ran the reset. So now if I come in and do anything, I can start to call this script from just other buttons, but it's basically going to now read that XML into here. And then it's going to start to work to pull this apart. And we're using standard things. So just like up in Vmix, where I loaded the Vmix XML, where I use load XML here, and I point to the API.xml, which Vmix stores. In this case, I'm loading the XML into score XML using XML scores, which is just the thing I read from the dynamic value up here. So it's just taking that XML, and then in the same way I'm leveraging the Vmix XML, I'm leveraging the XML stored in that dynamic value 1. So all I need to do now is, again, very, very simple XML parsing. I can say select the single node, because there's only one there with scores, and I want to take the scores with the attribute for Team A and take the inner text. That's the value inside that attribute. And so that's what I assign to score A. And I do the same for the attribute Team B. And that's what I assign to score B. After that, everything with manipulating it is identical. I convert score A, the value of score A as text, into an integer. Then I take and I pull in the score adjustment. We kept that in a separate variable, so we didn't change any of that logic. So that works identical to what we had before. And then I just add the score A to the score adjustment and put that back in score A. So now I've basically done the same thing, except using XML inside of a single dynamic variable. And to reconstruct that, I'm basically using this XML temp variable, which is a string, and I put that together and reassemble this with the new scores. So converting them to strings and setting these up as the attributes. So everything here basically allows me to pack in multiple scores into that one dynamic value. And then we just write it out here and make the adjustments on the scoreboard, just like before. Now, this obviously looks a lot more complicated. So why would we do this? Say I wanted to store a lot of things. I can do that now in XML. And that means I can really pack in data around a single dynamic variable. And a real use case for this would be, say I want to be able to say we're at the end of quarter one. The end of quarter is like change which quarter we're in. That would give me the ability to sort of take the score at the end of that quarter and put that into a box score for quarter one. And then when quarter two ends, I could come back and say, okay, what's the score that we have now? And I can subtract the score from the first quarter and say, well, that's what was scored in the second quarter. So I can store all this information inside of a single dynamic value. And that is really, really powerful because it basically means I think it's probably up to 256 bytes. I'm not sure. It could even be longer than that. But that would give you basically a lot of data that you can pack into a single variable and still leverage everything else you want to leverage. So that's one of the reasons for potentially wanting to use it in this way, as opposed to just individual elements. The other thing, which isn't really talked about because it isn't the intended use case, but I mentioned at the beginning, we have dynamic values and dynamic inputs. The dynamic inputs are also just text. And to be honest, it's rare. I'm not saying unheard of, but it's rare that you'd need more than one or two of the dynamic inputs, even for very sophisticated workflows where you're trying to, work through multiple keys. So this can give you, because they're just text, it can give you a couple more locations where you can store data. So you could actually say, as I want to use all my dynamic variables in a standard way, you can actually use the dynamic inputs this way. So you could take dynamic input 4 and say, I'm going to use that to store XML, and I'm going to read that XML in scripting. That would work fine too. So there's nothing really different that you'd need to do. All, in fact, you're doing up here is, if I go back here, where we say, what are we reading? Like when we read up here, we read, up here is value 4. Instead of where it says value, I believe I could just put input 4, and it would just read that text out of input 4, and I could write that the same way. So that just gives you even more storage that you can use inside of the Vmix structure that will persist between instances of a script or anything you do sort of in shortcuts. But to use this, you have to use scripting. There is no way to say, I want to take that input value and use it as just a dynamic value. It does not work that way in standard shortcuts, but it will work that way in scripting, where you're just using it to store and read data. Okay, so that's really everything that I wanted to cover here. Let me see if we have anything else here. So yeah, we have a few more comments. So we have Tosan, thank you for joining us. I definitely appreciate you making the time on a Friday night for this. Definitely enjoy it. So Lee, thank you. Lee and I had talked a bit about doing this for something that he was working on. I thought it would make an interesting show. So to a certain extent, Lee, you were my muse for the show. So thank you for joining us for it. So let's see. And we have Ryocaster. Thank you. I am doing great today. Hopefully this is working well for you and your day is going well. And things are on the right track. So thanks for joining. Okay, so this is everything that I really had for today. I know that this is fairly straightforward, but I think it gives you a different way to start to think about how you leverage the dynamic values that are in Vmix. Sometimes simply within shortcuts, other times in a more configurable way using scripting. And I think that's really important for especially more advanced things. One of the things, if you'll notice, so let me just sort of take a soft aside on what we've done in the past. We actually typically keep a script running in the background, and that's that thing where we do the select cases and do that. In that case, no pun intended, when we do it in that way, because the script constantly runs, we don't have to leverage something like a dynamic value to store this. But if this were something where you may say in the middle of a production, something goes down and you need it to keep that state, this could be something where even if you're doing something with that sort of loop in the background, you may turn around and say, anytime I change a value, which I will need if I restart the system, you could actually use these dynamic values or inputs, the variables in general, to store the state information and pick it up again. Note that that will only work if you are, keeping Vmix itself open. They do all go away if Vmix gets restarted. So that would only be useful if my script crashes or I have to restart something else and pick it up again. That could work. But that would be the only case that there is no long-term storage outside of writing something to a file, which is probably another good show to go into to talk a little bit more about how to do those types of things. But like I said, another show for that one. So hopefully you found this useful. What I'd like to do is probably wrap up today's show. For next week, I'll say that we're probably 50-50 whether we're going to do a show next week. We have some work in the field that we're going to be doing through most of next week. So stay tuned. I'll let everybody know in the Facebook group as we get to sort of end of Wednesday, Thursday, what we're going to be doing. But just want to let you know, our goal is to do it, but there's a possibility we won't be able to because of work constraints with being out of the office. But if possible, we will see everybody next Friday. And if you want to hang around, and I know there are a couple more comments here that we'll get to, and talk a bit more about different use cases here, just hang out for the post show, which will be starting in a minute. So until next week or until next show, be well, be safe. I'll see you then. Hello, welcome to our post-show hangout here. So I said I had a few more comments here, so let's jump right into those. So Ryo's asking if I ever tried Microsoft Express Blend. I have not yet. There's a lot of things that I definitely would like to get to. I know that's something that was mentioned in the past, so I'll reiterate it on my list because my lists tend to get lost in piles of other lists I make. So thank you for reminding me about that again. Definitely something I do want to look at. So Michael, thank you for making it for the show. Always great to see you here. So this is Michael's just asking what I think is an excellent question, and when I started, he's asking about using JSON versus XML. And the short answer is yes, it absolutely would be more efficient. The longer answer is that Vmix uses VB.NET 2.x. I'm not sure the exact version. There are no JSON libraries built into that. So anything that you do would have to be sort of outside of the Vmix scripting space. So you could use something like Node.js and JSON and read, from these variables in Node.js, but that's outside of, the Vmix scripting space. So that is why we use XML, is because that's what Vmix has inside the scripting component. But I 100% agree. When we started this out, I was like, let me see if I can use JSON, and I couldn't. So this is that, but that's a very good point. And I think hopefully that's one of the things that Vmix will start to migrate forward as they go on in versions. So we'll have to wait and see for 27 when it comes out. So, all right. So Lee Love is saying, so you were not able to pull a dynamic value from a script and pull that into a script that uses functions. So inside of Vmix scripting, there are no function support. So Vmix scripting, I'm assuming it's the way it's running under Vmix that sort of stops you from building it out as a full environment, as full scripting environment. Scripting is really the right term. There are no functions that you can set up. You can set them up in VB.NET, but there are no functions supported under Vmix scripting. So in that sense, you can't, which is, if you look at some of the things we've done around the loop in the background with the switch case, we kind of use that almost like I'm calling functions. I say, what action do I want to take and what values do I want to pass into that action, which is almost like a function in variables. And that's how we've done a lot of those things in the past. That's really because there are no true functions inside of Vmix scripting. The dynamic values, though, are available throughout the entire Vmix framework. So when I run something inside of Vmix, if it's the same script, it can pick it up and read it, that dynamic value. If it's a different script, so I can sort of run script A and then run script B, and script A could set something up and script B could take that data and do something with it. So you can pass that back and forth. You can also use it to set up the dynamic values to be used in shortcuts. So that you can do something, I could do something like this where I'm changing the scores using scripting, but then I have something that's a standard Vmix shortcut to update that score on the screen. So again, lots of different use cases, but sort of the scope of the dynamic variables is across the entire Vmix instance as it's running. And whether it's scripting or shortcuts, that's all available. Hopefully that answers the question. Share that list with us. Trying to see what list, if you could give me a little more data on this. Oh, if you're talking about the list of things I have to look at, well, we have a new control surface switcher that we are evaluating for somebody. We have a couple of new cameras that we're working on for somebody. I'm doing a script to help out a friend who asked for some help, and I'm also running a business. So we've got a lot of stuff going on, both things that I do for the show, as well as things that I'm sort of working on as my day job to keep the lights on. So sorry, I didn't get that right away. I just had one of the guys say it's probably the list of things you got on your plate. So yeah, and that's one of those things where that list it never really ends. I mean, it doesn't really even get asymptotically close to ending. It just sort of stays at a high level and things fall off through gentrification more than anything else, I think. So let's see. Yeah, Michael, he's saying that's old. Yeah, the .NET 2.0 is fairly old, and there's a lot of limitations in that. I think it would just, even going to .NET 3 would open up a lot more capabilities on the scripting side. So we'll see what the future holds on that. But yeah, it is pretty old. So Lee, okay, glad that helped. Good, Lee, thanks. And let's see, so we have Dave say, Dave says his takeaway is to get to know the dynamic variables better within Vmix to help reduce the number of shortcut keys we currently use for our client setups. So absolutely. I mean, that's sort of the first major use case for it, where you could sit there, and that's especially true with dynamic inputs, where if you want to set up say, like I'll use a case, with a live to air kind of instance, I could set up dynamic inputs that I would then use to set layers. And so I could go and say, I want to put in, live to air channel 1, 4, 5, and 7 into dynamic inputs 1 through 4, and then use that to populate a multi-box that I have on there. So that way I can just keep the one multi-box up and just use the dynamic values to switch who goes in them. So simple things like that. And where that would really work well, because yes, you can change layers. Like I could just go in and say, with scripting, I could go and say, okay, change what's in layers 1 to 4 on an input. But if I had a whole range of inputs that would be like a 3-box in the host, a 3-box on the side with a screen capture, I don't have to do anything special then, because I can just use the dynamic values for those things. And that would give me, a little more flexibility with how that all gets set up. So just off the top of my head, I don't know how specifically practical, but I think you can understand, that's where it would help. Dynamic values are great for passing state between instances of a shortcut. So if I'm doing something in one shortcut that leverages a value, I can leverage that same value in other shortcuts. If I'm using scripting in shortcuts, I can change that value in scripting and leverage it in other shortcuts. So different ways to use to walk into this from standard shortcuts with dynamic values, with dynamic variables, into scripting with dynamic variables. But the two play together very nicely. So let's see. Dave's saying he's not ready for scripting just yet. Well, let me, because that's a good point. So let me see if I can switch over, and I just want to show something here, because I think it could be helpful. If I go to my if I take this type of code here, where it's just, I want to take and I want to read this and just sort of pull this value in, I could take this. Now I have to set up, and declare all my variables. But if I go over to my Vmix UI, so let me sort of jump in here and show you one shortcut that can really be your friend here. So if I go and add a new shortcut here, the function is under scripting, it's script start dynamic. And what I can do is I can just paste small blocks of code in here. So I could take this piece of code. So let me just go over here and I'll just, I could take this piece of code here and I could take and say, all the things that I had to declare for that. So just let's pull this in. I don't need all of this. But I could just take this by itself. So I have this and everything I declared. And now inside of here, I just have this, was basically a really small script that I leverage here. And I can just tie that into something. And when I run that, this will now execute that. Now I pasted this. I have no clue whether this is going to sort of blow up on me or not. But this will basically take and run this little script that I put in here. And again, really, really useful for that. So even if you don't want to go sort of all in on more complicated scripting, this could be something where, say you wanted to use it with a playlist and say, or a list of inputs you wanted to walk through. You could use this to just walk through them and say, okay, now after I finish showing one, just increment my dynamic value by 1, and I'll be pointing to the next one when I go into the playlist to pull out the next video or audio I want to play. So you can use it for some simple things. So I know when I sort of show the scripting here, I'm sort of over in Visual Studio Code, and there's a lot of things going on. But I think you can also start to look at it in a very small, compact fashion, where I basically declare a few things, manipulate them, and then use standard shortcuts to do most of what I want. So you can go API.function and describe the shortcut. So simpler things to do inside of Vmix scripting. And with script start dynamic, I think that's a good way to sort of move into that deeper space without becoming overwhelmed with coding. So just a thought I wanted to share, because that script start dynamic is very useful for those types of very targeted, I just want to increment whatever is in that dynamic value by 1 or by 10 or whatever. You can do those types of things without a lot of code or a lot of overhead, and just treat it like any other shortcut. All right, let's see. Yeah, I mean, Dave's saying he has to keep things simple because of the number of clients they support. Yeah, so I agree. I mean, once you get into scripting, there's certainly there's higher maintenance associated with managing things with scripts. But if you have things that you sort of keep as a toolkit and use them in something like this, that's potentially something that could be useful to you, where you're basically not doing a whole lot of different things. You just turn around and say, no, this is sort of in my standard toolkit of things I want to work with. So like I said, it's just an option, but you can do an awful lot, using sort of the standard shortcut model with the dynamic values. But definitely, if you're not using dynamic values, that could be really, really helpful for you. So let's see. So Lee's asking about doing a show on Vmix scripting to control live to air. So yeah, so we've actually been talking about that, because it is possible to do control live to air through scripting. We have a new backend that we're coming out that would probably be better suited for a lot of people starting to run more complex scripting against live to air, because ultimately, with all of these things, some of them are going to be local data, but some of them are going to be state data that we store centrally. And so we need to make sure that our backend could handle this at scale. So I'll say it's coming, Lee. Let's probably look for that. If anything, probably late this year. And because we should have a new backend up by then that will be more comfortable sort of advertising for general scripting support. Okay, what else do we have? All right. I think that probably is a good point to stop here, unless there are other specific questions. But I think the interesting part about keeping sort of state in general is that you can start to leverage this to do more complex shortcuts. So at the foundational level, as Dave was pointing out, you can do things that are simpler, in terms of the number of buttons you need to set up, because you can have one row of buttons to say, I want to pick the input, and then another row of buttons to say, what do I want to do to that input? As opposed to saying, I have to sort of say, I want to do item A to input 1, and then I want to do item A to input 2. Those become sort of separate buttons. Now you can turn around and say, no, I just have inputs 1 to 4, and I have items A to D, and I can just say, I want to do item D to input 2. and that works. So as opposed to saying I have to have sort of 16 buttons set up for like do A to D for input 1, A to D for input 2, like that, I can just turn around and say pick an input, pick an action, go. And so that can simplify your workflow, simplify the number of buttons that you have to set up on your X keys or Stream Deck. So Tosan, yeah, so I think, if you're talking about the example I mentioned with like changing lanes and stuff, I think all that stuff is possible. I spoke off the top of my head for that, so I'm not sure, exactly, all that I covered all the steps around that. But clearly this is something that, can make life easier from your setup, your configuration of button pushes for shortcuts and navigation. So yeah, so Lee is saying that always thinking a year ahead. Yep. So just understand when you're on the side that's writing the code instead of using the code, that year looks tight as opposed to when you're sitting there saying, "Gee, a year's such a long time. Why do I have to wait that long?" That's just the the glass half full, glass half empty, translated to the people who write code versus the people who use code. So, but yes, totally know you right now, Lee. Thank you. So yeah, thank you, Michael. Let me say. So on our last show, the audio was terribly out of sync, but it wasn't because of SRT. In fact, if we had SRT, we would have stood a much better chance of handling this successfully. We ended up, there were storms rolling up the East Coast last week. And so we're just, in New Jersey, outside of the New York area. And we had internet issues. It didn't go down. So we didn't lose the signal, but we were jumping between 1 megabit and 3 megabits. So basically happened just sort of before the show started. So we were dropping video and we were having audio sync. SRT could have helped, assuming that maybe some of those spaces in there would have made a difference, we would have been able to catch up and we could have had latency. But if in fact it stayed down in 1 to 2, we were streaming at 7 megabits per second, I think, is our stream rate, which is sort of a compromise to, be kind to the uplink bandwidth. But if we stayed at that and it never got above, the sort of 3 megabits, it would have just taken a little bit longer, but the same things would have happened. But that was definitely issues with our internet. I will just say that we had the cable company out here to check out our lines. They said everything looked good. We've been testing it again today, and it is questionable. So we think there may be still some stuff going on, whether it's legacy stuff or some new issues that just weren't resolved or loading on the lines that are outside of us. We're not sure, but hopefully today's show is streaming smoothly. And but yeah, it wasn't because of SRT. That was simply because of a storm and our internet provider, who has caused no end of stress for us when it comes to our uplink and downlink connections here. So, but thanks for pointing that out. That's something I should have addressed right away in the after show. So thank you. Oh, okay, Lee, thank you. I appreciate you joining on the show today. It's always fun to have you here. Okay, so Dave is saying he's mainly manually scoring sports and running ads using lists. So actually, Dave, if you are using this for sports, we did a show last season which basically gave you almost a numeric keypad where you could type 1 or 2 digits. And we were using it in the case of that show to call up jersey numbers. So if you wanted to say, I want to call up the stats on player, number 18 on team A, we actually set up something which used, a little bit of scripting to do that. So, that's just another example of some of the things that, sort of with course judicious use of scripting, it could make certain things a lot easier and simpler for you. So, but thanks for sharing that. I think sports is a great area for a lot of the things that Vmix really excels at. So thank you. Oh, yeah. So Michael, yeah, thank you. I mean, it wasn't that the storm was so bad. I mean, it was, it was a lot of wind but nothing, tornado or typhoonish going on. And there's been a lot of people that have been incredibly hard hit, both here and in a lot of locations globally. So, clearly we were not anywhere near that, but it was strong enough that it interfered with the infrastructure we were leveraging. So in that sense, we're very lucky. So I have no complaints on the macro level. It's just from the show level. I wanted to let everybody know sort of what was going on. But thank you. So, oh, Marco, hi, how are you? Yeah, so everything should be up. Glad you're able to drop in to say hi. But everything will be up on the recording, so you should be able to dive into this. And if you have any questions, after that, just post them in the comments, and we'll try to get back. So sorry you weren't able to make it, but totally get everybody's schedule can be pretty hectic these days. All right then. So I guess we will probably wrap it up for this week. As I mentioned, 50-50 chance we're going to do a show next week. If not, it'll be the week after. But we do have a lot going on next week out of sight at a client location. So, we'll do our best. But just be aware, if you don't see us next Friday, we'll let you know by sort of Thursday, what's going on. We'll see you the Friday after. And as always, I appreciate all of you joining us live, and everybody who isn't coming live, who's just watching this on the replay. We really, really are grateful for having you be part of this community. So until the next show, be safe, be well, and we'll see you then. Take care.